On July 5, 2016, Jacob Childs, the Australian-born technical diver, was a part of a dive cruise to the Althea Shipwreck. This shipwreck, being 30 nautical miles northeast of the town called Bundaberg in Australia, is a pretty basic dive many shops in the area will take customers on. Having over 4,500 dives under his belt, Jacob joined that day as a paid freelance instructor and was a part of the three-man crew. Hiring him for the day's work for around $20, Jacob went into it knowing there were many red flags with this specific dive shop and crew. This particular dive captain wasn't licensed to be a dive boat captain in Australia or anywhere else. Not being an accredited captain should have been enough for Jacob, but there were further red flags, such as the boat they were using that day didn't meet survey requirements, and in Jacob's own words, the whole thing was dodgy. On board that day was Jacob, the dive master, the dive captain, and 3 paying customers. Jacob says that the plan was to dive at the local shipwreck that is notoriously good for recreational divers, of which they had 3 that day. Being a non-compression dive, they didn't plan on going very deep as the wreck sits 120 feet underneath the surface. In total, they planned to spend about 4 minutes at the bottom and then slowly head up to the surface. A total of 25 to 30 minutes was the original plan, as it could take 10 minutes either way to ascend or descend. During the pre-dive meeting, Jacob and the dive master agreed to add a few mandatory decompression stops on the way back to the surface as a practice exercise for safety purposes. This added time to the overall ascent back to the boat, but they knew it was important to practice these skills whenever they could. The group of 6 left the dive shop early in the morning and reached the shipwreck around midday. The team then began to suit up and went through their final prep for the dive. As the wreck divers finished getting ready, Jacob jumped into the water. The second he jumped into the ocean, he noticed the current was strong. Estimating about 5 knots or 6 miles per hour, he would have had to actively swim to maintain his position to not get swept away. Thankfully, the boat had multiple lines attached, meant for divers to hold on, which Jacob quickly latched onto. Holding onto the line attached to the boat for about 10 minutes, Jacob started to notice his arms becoming fatigued. At that moment, the whole team took the plunge off the boat and into the water, thus beginning the dive. Quickly, the dive master took the lead and 2 of the wreck divers followed. Jacob would be the 4th in the line, and the last wreck diver took up the rear. As they made it down the line towards the wreck, almost instantly, the diver behind Jacob had problems with his ears due to the pressure and began to tap on Jacob, indicating he needed to surface. Turning around to check on the diver, Jacob lost grip on the line and began to drift. Instead of fighting the current to get back on the line, he thought he would just swim the 10 feet up to the boat and descend again once back on the line to find the distressed diver. Once he was on the surface, he got to the side of the boat and realized the side of the boat was too tall to grab on. This being a fishing boat and not meant for divers in the water, it was crucial that there was other lines in the water for the divers to hold on to. Looking around for the lines that were set out to the rear and to the sides of the boat, he didn't see anything. Later finding out, the captain pulled all the lines out of the water almost instantly after they submerged, hoping to catch some big fish. There was nothing for Jacob to grab onto, but he was talking with the captain. They had a full conversation about the lines and about getting him back on the boat as Jacob quickly drifted away. The whole group had planned for this exact situation just hours ago. Jacob was confident he would drift away, and the captain would set a buoy on the anchor line, disconnect from it, and go retrieve Jacob down the drift pattern within a short period of time. Then they would return to the buoy, tie off again on the anchor, and get the rest of the team. Jacob, knowing he had to stay visible, fully inflated his SMB, which is a 6-foot-long orange inflatable tube which allows divers to be seen over the waves of the open ocean. Back on the boat, the captain ignored what was previously discussed and decided to wait for the other divers to return to the boat before going to get Jacob. The main error in this thinking was that the waves that day were about 4 feet tall, so drifting at the speed Jacob was, him and his tall SMB were quickly lost amongst the blue waves. Below the surface, the dive team of 3 continued downwards as the single diver with the ear problem made their way back to the boat. After noticing Jacob and the other wreck diver were no longer there, the 3 divers under the water made the decision to call it and return to the surface. On their way up, they planned to practice the decompression exercises they talked about just to say that they did something. When they finally got to the boat, they were startled to see that Jacob was missing. At this point, Jacob had been drifting for 20 to 25 minutes before the boat even left the anchor point to go looking, and it was simply too late for him to be found. He was gone. After an hour of drifting, he did briefly see the boat again. Watching the captain on the bow looking for him, he began to wave his SMB and scream at the top of his lungs, but was unable to get any attention. Also finding out later that the captain didn't even call the Coast Guard for over 2 hours after he was officially lost, Jacob at this point was in deep trouble. Waiting until the boat was almost out of fuel, the captain waited until the very last moment to call for rescue. The thought is that the captain was too afraid to call it in hopes that he could find Jacob and this would be a non-issue. Not even being licensed or allowed to have paying customers on board, calling the Coast Guard was the worst-case scenario for the captain and the dive shop. To Jacob's benefit, after getting the call from the captain, the Coast Guard was very quick to react. Sending in helicopters and multiple boats to search, they knew time wasn't on their side. If they couldn't find Jacob before the next morning, they knew the chances of rescue were slim. An hour after the search began, 3 hours after he went missing, Jacob saw a trawler boat moving in a zigzag pattern slowly going away from him. His plan was to ditch all his non-floatable gear and to use his SMB as a flotation device, and to swim for the trawler. Swimming as hard as he could for about an hour and a half, he realized he was getting no closer to the trawler and gave up hope. Becoming very thirsty at this point, he wasn't too cold and was floating just fine. His new plan was to stay still, conserve energy, and try to be as visible to the sky as possible. The helicopters were still buzzing around, but the sun was moving lower in the sky and he knew the light was fading. But then, all of a sudden, he spotted a plane in the air doing wide circles overhead. Very odd, he thought, as he floated on his back waiting. This plane was from Australian Customs. Using infrared technology, they were on a mission to catch any illegal immigration from the Oceania region, a few hundred miles away from where Jacob was at. Hearing about the lost diver, they flew down to the location of the shipwreck using a bearing that would get them there right at nightfall. Setting up the infrared technology right as they arrived, the observer on board used a tiger shark to dial in the specific infrared vision. This tiger shark coincidentally led the plane directly to Jacob, giving them a eureka moment. Knowing there were sharks in the water, they quickly gave the rescue boats his coordinates and began to circle directly overhead Jacob. Down in the water, Jacob saw the plane quickly change paths and began to tightly circle over him. Knowing this meant they saw him, he had a sense of relief. This relief was quickly dashed as both the plane and the helicopter completely disappeared from his sight. Later he found out that the plane went super high in the air as to not interfere with any kind of rescue that may have been planned. The plane and helicopters were in contact with the rescue boats the whole time, and they were on their way in. At this point, it is complete darkness when the rescue boat arrives on scene. Having no lights on him, Jacob had much difficulty getting to and on the boat. Once aboard the boat, in a sick joke, the only beverage they had to offer was ice-cold water. Saying afterwards all he wanted was some hot tea, he did eventually get this when he was moved to a Coast Guard boat. Finally getting ashore about 2 hours later, he was greeted by a police sergeant for an interview. Telling the sergeant that the dive was on a friend-only basis and not a commercial dive, Jacob covered for the captain and the others in leadership involved. He did say that he made a mistake. He should have told the truth, and believes that many people should have had their asses handed to them for what happened that day. A lot of things went wrong, and the circumstances perpetually got worse, from the fact that procedures weren't followed to not notifying the authorities quick enough. The captain of the boat truly was in over his head and didn't recognize the danger he put everyone in that day. Jacob now believes he has properly equipped himself for open ocean diving with GPS devices as well as other rescue devices to help him in the future in case this ever were to happen again. Nothing ever came of the interview, and the captain remains to run dives to this very day. He did get his license in order to do so, but other incidences have happened which puts his trustworthiness in question. All the information for this story was pulled from the Dive Talk podcast. The link is below for the full interview with Jacob Childs. Please, if you want a longer form explanation of this story, go watch their video. Woody and Gus have a great channel and provide some of the best diving content on the internet. But that concludes the story of how Jacob Childs was deserted at sea. If you want to hear more scary, fascinating stories, make sure to check out my last video.